And this is attitudinal. This is how he said, well, all the big pharmaceutical companies, we're trying so hard to preserve our patent, and basically what we want is 100% of the business of 15% of the world. He said it's a stupid business model. Better to take a lower profit margin and sell to the other 85%. So every one of you faces decisions like this. Whatever it is you're doing. And you have to say, is there a different way to look at this? Is there a different way to, can you imagine a different outcome where you don't ask anybody else to take a hit? You just figure out a different way for people to win so that there are more winners. Biggest public health problem in America is childhood obesity. You have an initiative in the UK, there's one in Ireland. It's a huge problem now in India, as they abandon the world's best diet, I think, for Western fat foods that will kill you quicker as they move to cities. And when I had my heart surgery and some of the advocates asked me to take this issue on, I thought, you know, I'm going to fail at this. Changing a culture is like turning the Titanic around before it hits the iceberg. There's billions and billions of decisions are made every day about how food is produced, transported, packaged, sold, and consumed. But I learned one thing, that 50 to 60% of the total calories, a lot of kids, mostly lower income kids, the total calories they were consuming every day, they were getting out of just high sugar drinks they got in school. Just the drinks. So all the advocates were saying we need to have a tax on these drinks. I'm not in Congress, so I don't get a vote on that. I'm not president anymore, I can't propose a bill. Besides, there'd be a riot in America if we tried to tax people's soft drinks. much. So anyway, I thought about the AIDS thing. We got all the soft drink people together. And we said, look at what's happening to the rate of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, the kind you get from living, not the kind you're born with, was commonly called in the US for decades adult onset diabetes. And 3 years ago, the American Medical Association said, you have to stop that. We have too many children with type 2 diabetes before their teen years, all because of what they're eating and how they are or are not exercising. So we got all the big soft drink people together. Coke, Pepsi, Cadbury, Schweppes, and a lot of the people with the high sugar die a happy death in old age. And I don't believe that you were intentionally trying to make this the first generation of Americans to live shorter lives than their parents. But you're all meeting the competition. If, however, you all agreed to get those full sugar soft drinks out of the schools, out of the vending machines, out of the cafeterias, if you all agreed to get the full-size juice drinks, which are heavy in sugar, out of the schools, if you went to more flavored waters, if you went to other things, and you did it together, you would all be making money, you'd just be making it in a different way. And if you have a long time horizon, you'd have these customers around for much longer in a future where your operating costs from healthcare would be lower. And all my friends in the advocacy community said that I had finally lost my mind, that I was living in another planet, I was so naive. Last month, we got a 4-year report. There has been, totally voluntarily in the United States, a 90% reduction in the total calories shipped to our schools from drinks. 90%. It was a business deal. It was humanitarian, it was generous, it was kind, it was compassionate, but it worked for them. And so that's the larger point I want to make to you today. We got to find ways to make climate change work as an economic opportunity. I just don't buy this idea. Even the UN panel said for us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, we only have to cut global GDP by 1%, and if we don't do it, natural disasters are going to cut it 4 or 5 times more. I don't buy that. I think changing the way we produce and consume energy and resources and doing more with less is the single biggest economic opportunity of the next 20 years for the global economy, after which we'll have explosive opportunities in biotechnology and God only knows what else. So on a much more limited basis, we just set out to try to prove that, and we looked for partners. Haiti has a horrible protein shortage. It has only 10% as much fish consumption as Jamaica, for example. So there's a guy in Haiti who was born in the Ivory Coast, who moved to Haiti to feed hungry people, who has a fish farming operation that runs entirely on solar power. He raises these fish until they are about that size, tilapia. Then he gives them to farmers and shows them how to grow them in lakes, natural lakes, and he splits the profit with them. I met a farmer, a Haitian farmer with 8 children, whose income went from $500 a year to $2,200 a year, being part of this system, and we are raising the health of the people. A woman, about 70% of these fish grow to full size and are sold in restaurants and markets. The other 30% are sold on the street in Haiti by women who can earn more money in 3 hours in the morning selling fish in the market than they can working in a factory for 8 hours a day. All because of the use of solar power in a smart, intelligent way. If you go to Sao Paulo, one of the biggest cities in the world, at the site of the 2 major landfills, they're trying to close the landfills by recycling all the plastic, metal, and glass, by taking all the organic matter and turning it into fertilizer for farmers, and everything else goes into power plants. So instead of emitting very harmful methane gases, they're creating clean electricity. We should close every landfill in every big city in the entire world. It's an economic winner if you do it right. Fundamental problem in all this clean energy stuff is getting the financing right, because all the costs are up front and the benefits are over a lifetime. But if you do it, it's a great thing. There are 2 big developments. These whole developments will be zero emission developments. I was just in the Danish city of Sønderborg, which is just across the German border in southern Denmark. They aim to be a zero emissions county, 80,000 people, zero emissions by 2029. And they have great little buttons, because you have to look at it twice, because it seems strange to pass someone wearing a button that says, "I'm a zero." What looks like a put down is actually bragging. But they reduced their emissions 18% in 3 years. They're going to do 25% more by 2020, and they'll be down to zero emissions. The island of Borgland, which is part of Denmark, has 44,000 people. It's already carbon positive when it comes to electricity. That is, they produce more from the sun and the wind, and they have very rigorous building standards, so they have super efficient, that they're sending power back to the main island where Copenhagen is. They aim to be a zero emissions island quicker than Sønderborg. So the 44,000 people had a massive community meeting and decided that they would all drive electric cars on the island. They would buy these electric mini cars and drive them around on their island, and they wouldn't drive their regular cars except when they went on long trips. So A friend of mine, an American, opened a plant in the United States, and his first 2 years of production are already accounted for by one island in Denmark. These little two-seater cars. And they're going to do it. Hundreds of jobs have been created by this one little island. There is nothing that would create more opportunity for entrepreneurs, for the revival of manufacturing, than changing the way we produce and consume energy. By far, the most labor-intensive thing you could do is to retrofit all the buildings. London started this whole movement among big cities, and I believe now, and Ken Livingston started, Mayor Johnson has continued it, I believe that London has in train plans for 231 major building retrofits. You got a lot more buildings than that. You need to make it more attractive. Essentially, I haven't worked out the pounds ratio, but essentially, in the US, for every $1 billion you invest in retrofitting buildings, the average payout of which is somewhere between, depending on how much you save energy, 3 and 6 years. For every $1 billion you create 7,000 new jobs. That's a very job-intensive thing to do. And you can train people to do this work who don't have a lot of formal education. So if you look at it like an entrepreneur who happens to be an environmentalist, who happens not to want the UK flooded by the rise of the oceans, you come up with a whole different set of possibilities than if you look at it as if the only thing we have to do is pass a bunch of regulations and force people to do the right thing. You're creating a chance for people to flourish in a whole new entrepreneurial cluster. If you can do it with public health, if you can do it with climate change, you can do the same thing with the education challenges we face, the same thing. I could go through lots of other things. And so I ask you to think about that. I think the 21st century world will rise or fall essentially on how people make 3 decisions. How are they going to relate to each other? So I love the work that Tony Blair's Faith Foundation does around the world. How do you respect who you are? Your race, your culture, your faith, or lack thereof. The world is becoming less racist, less sexist, and less homophobic in most places, but not everywhere. And even in places where people fancy themselves as totally broad-minded and accepting of others, most people still have one bad blind spot. They do not wish to be around anybody they disagree with. Don't you find that? It's a huge problem in America. We have been sorting ourselves out for 30 years now based on who we agree with. In 1976, we had a close presidential election in America. And our counties, where the lines never changed, at the same boundaries. Only 20% of America's counties voted for either Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford by 20% or more. Every place else was closer. So if you walked into a salon or a cafe, people were sitting around with their friends and neighbors, honestly arguing the competing merits of their candidates and the positions. There were relationships. By 2004, when Senator John Kerry gave President Bush the closest re-election of any president re-elected since Woodrow Wilson in 1916, it was a much closer election, people know, because the war in Iraq was ongoing, and in the history of America, no president's ever been defeated while a war was going on. But 48% of the counties voted for one or the other of them by more than 20%. President Obama just won a titanic victory in the state of Ohio, which is a pretty... and I worked hard for it. But, no, here's the point for you and your neighbors. Think of this. But in the race for the House of Representatives, my party did worst in the so-called swing states. Why? Because we won those states by getting the people who already disagreed with us to the polls. And the Republicans tried to win it by doing the same thing, which meant that the districts where my party had somebody representing, which had at least as many of the other guys as us, they all got beat. They were sort of corollary casualties of a world in which we don't support reaching across the divide. So how we manage our differences, number one. Number two, how we manage technology. You like all these drones that fly around in the airport? How are you going to feel when they're the size of bumblebees? How can technology continue to be humanity's friend? And finally, how we manage our relationship to the earth, which is screaming at us to remember basic things like photosynthesis. If you want to put more carbon in the air, you need something breathing it back in so we can sustain the balance of the earth. I am convinced that all over the world, people in the public and the private sectors and the NGOs are going to have to think more like entrepreneurs, less bureaucratically, less rigidly, less sanctimoniously, and less like we got all the answers. And whether we like it or not, we are going to have to spend time talking to people, and more important, listening to people who don't look like us, don't think like us, don't live like us, and may think we're taking the world to hell in a handbasket. And unless we figure out how to do that, we are going to have a very difficult time in an interdependent world where all our borders look more like nets than walls. But if we do that, then all of you who are younger than me, which is virtually 100% of this audience, will live in the most interesting time in human history. And this financial crisis will just be a bad dream that led a long hangover. It'll go away. The fundamental forces, the big trend lines, involve the battles of empowerment, inclusion, and entrepreneurialism on one side against the forces of inequality, instability, and unsustainability on the other. I'd give anything. I would give up having been president to be 25 years old and have a chance to chart a course through the next 30 years. It should be the most interesting time in human history. I wish you well, and I hope you make the most of it. Thank you.